At this very moment, every single person in this room has cells in their body that could protect against HIV infection. Think about that for a minute. Just let that sink in. Floating around in your body right now are cells that could prevent HIV infection. Unfortunately, these cells are completely oblivious to their great power. The cells don't know how to fight HIV. What the cells need is a trainer. And that trainer is the vaccine that researchers have been trying to develop for decades. Unfortunately, every vaccine that's been tested hasn't really protected against HIV infection. So why is this? And the answer to that is we don't know. But my lab aims to find out. Now, one of the reasons why making an HIV vaccine has been so difficult is that the virus is constantly changing. And these changes allow HIV to elude potential fighters. But this doesn't mean that making an HIV vaccine is not possible. There are certain small regions of HIV that it can't change. These are HIV's weak spots. So the vaccine that ultimately protects against HIV will train the cells that can target these weak spots. The type of cells that I'm talking about are called B cells. And you have probably about 100 billion of these in your body right now, which sounds like a lot, and it is. But unfortunately, almost all of these cells are completely useless in the fight against HIV. And the reason for this is that every single B cell is unique. Every B cell expresses a unique hook called a receptor. And a small number of B cells have receptors that can bind to one of HIV's weak spots. Nobody knows how many of these cells exist. We think the number is probably close to 1 in a million, or maybe even 1 in 10 million B cells can bind to one of HIV's weak spots. But don't be afraid of these numbers. If all of us have 1 in 10 million cells that can bind to HIV's weak spots, this is more than enough to protect against infection, as long as we teach these cells how to fight. For many years, researchers have been looking for the fully trained fighter B cells after vaccination. And they can't find them. And the reason they can't find them is that the vaccines failed. So we've thrown out this approach. We're instead looking for the untrained B cells targeting HIV's weak spots before vaccination. And we're doing this because we think part of the reason why HIV vaccines haven't worked to this point is because the B cells that target HIV's weak spots don't bind to the vaccine. And this binding is absolutely critical. If the vaccine doesn't bind to the B cell targeting the weak spot, it remains completely oblivious. It doesn't even start its training. So we're looking for this binding. What my lab does is pretty simple. We take the vaccine, we modify it to make it metallic, and then we mix this with millions or billions of B cells from the blood. We then use a magnet to pull out the cells that bind to this vaccine candidate. And now what we can do, now that we have these cells in our hands, is we can start to address whether any of these bind to HIV's weak spots. Now we might find with the candidate vaccine that we're looking at that none of the cells that bind to it actually target HIV's weak spots. And if we find this, we'll throw that vaccine out. It's not going to work because the cells that can be protective don't bind to it. Using our approach, we can screen through dozens, maybe even hundreds potential vaccine candidates and throw out all the ones that have no chance of working. And we can do this without having to inject the vaccine into a single person. So we can spend all of our time and effort on the one vaccine candidate that has a chance to work because the weak spot targeting B cells will bind to it. Now, I've spent all of my time talking about HIV vaccines, but the beauty of our method is it can be modified for basically any infection for which a vaccine does not exist, or infections where there's a vaccine but they're not quite optimal. I mean, wouldn't it be great to have a lifetime flu vaccine? hopefully, or as my small 4-person lab grows over the next couple of years, we're going to turn our attention to some of these other infections. Because just like HIV, the cells able to protect against these serious infections are floating around in your body at this very moment. We just need to teach these cells how to fight. Thank you.